Hello and welcome to this week's video on My Hero Academia. This week I will be reviewing the first volume of Vigilantes. Now, well, admit, dear listener, I am doing this because my next copies of the manga haven't arrived yet, so this week I'm doing a volume review. Now, don't expect this to become a frequent thing unless this video gets decent views and likes and subscriptions, so with that in mind, you know the rules and so do I. Let me know what you thought about this particular volume in the comment section down below, and you will be read out in next week's show, and be sure to support your local small content creator today. It will do them a power of good. Now on to the review, and as we often do with all our reviews, we start out with the positives, and I have to say that this manga is a refreshing change of pace from the original source material. It shows us a side of this society that's never been referenced in the main series to any real discernible degree, and gives us a point of view that feels more nuanced and complex than in the main series itself. This isn't to say that Vigilantes has a hidden depth to it thematically or subtextually which is equal to or greater than the main series, nor is this to say that this is, in other words, a deep piece of fiction, but it does show us a more diverse view on superhero work within this world, and arguably more on a more broad degree on superhero fiction more generally. Our hero best exemplifies this with them being something of a cynical optimist. They understand the true nature of this world and how things really work. However, this has not given them some kind of darker worldview. This puts them in a great contrast to Izuku Midoriya in the main series, who has a far more optimistic and idealistic view on what it is to be a hero, and as a contrast to other superhero vigilante characters, particularly in Western media, who more often than not cut a little bit more of a dour and more morose figure, who oftentimes see themselves as being, for want of a better phrase, a cure to the illnesses that plague society, rather than in reality them just being another symptom of it. Crawler understands that his chances of becoming a pro-hero have faded, and that his only real way in being a hero is doing minor good deeds to help the locals, which, while certainly in something of a legal grey area, aren't the kind of things that he can be sent to prison for. You know, him using his quirk to help an old lady cross the street probably isn't going to get him sent down to prison for a couple months or have him do community service, but it's still something he might get a fine over. And more generally, he doesn't really fight others from what little that we know of him of his previous history, only really doing fighting as a last resort. He's that kind of superhero that you would end up seeing on your local news. We all know these kind of characters because they pop up on the local news every now and again, regardless of where in the world you're actually from. You know the types, the ones that, well, there's very cheap looking superhero costumes, usually someone that's been knocked together over the course of a fortnight or so, who've decided to become a superhero in their local area, who in reality just kind of patrol the areas that they live and try and stop some very petty crimes, you know, like stopping kids playing football in the street, or loitering, or wagging their fingers at people that are littering, you know, unlike the other quote-unquote real superheroes who decide to do their superhero work outside nightclubs and to stop people taking drugs or getting drunk and then end up getting stabbed or horribly maimed by some of the locals. You know, he's definitely the more your friendly neighbourhood superhero, which is neat and it's cute, and to give something of a pop culture reference, Crawler definitely in the beginning of this series feels like Kick-Ass had Kick-Ass stayed in his own lane. However, whilst he knows he's incredibly unlikely to ever really be a legal hero, he will still do his best to be as much of a hero as he can be. Something that I'll admit that I'm not sure Midoriya could have or would have done had he not got one for all or got it into UA, but that's a whole of discussion for all other time. Whilst I won't say at this point I feel that Crawler is a more complex character with a deeper shade to him in comparison to Midoriya, I do like the fact that he lacks the wide-eyed optimism that Midoriya has. Both are, to be honest, characters that I can identify with, which helps me connect with them and the wider piece itself. Midoriya is that youthful, optimistic vision of yourself that really wants to do good and to get their dream job, and Crawler represents the slightly more jaded side of you that knows that ship has sailed, but you'll still do the absolute best with what you have available to you. How much you yourself might ultimately find either of these characters relatable is a different strokes of different folks things, and how you might find them relatable later on will ultimately determine how their respective stories goes, but regardless, I want to see where things are going, because I do think that both of them are still great and strong characters within their own right. Crawler knows that the world isn't quite as rosy as Midori would like to see it, but at the same time he doesn't want to let himself dwell in his own darkness. He is not your typical superhero vigilante character, as mentioned previously. He will still try to do good, even if he knows that the amount of good that he can do legally is rather limited. He still has a shred and a glow of optimism within him, even if it isn't quite so bright that he'll end up doing things that might put himself in genuine jeopardy. He really is a rather interesting character, and like I say, I'm interested to see where he might be developed going forward. One of the things I really do feel helps support this series is its strong supporting cast. I will admit that the opening episode did signpost its extended cast a little bit too deliberately for my liking. It was a case of going, here's the mentor, here is the rival slash love interest, here is the potential main villain, and then later, here is our core mystery and the threat that they must face, and I understand why that is the case, because the opening episode was functionally a pilot. It had to get all the busy work done there and then, because it might not get a second bite of the cherry, but all the same, it did feel a little bit too signposted for my liking. But with that said, the two main characters, or rather two extended cast members it ends up giving us, Popstep and Knuckle Duster, are really fantastic in my opinion, though I do feel that Knuckle Duster is the more interesting of the two. He is the Batman to All Might Superman. He's Batman without the subtlety and with an endless bloody-minded determination. He's almost a force of nature. When he gets his sights on a target, he won't stop until they're taken out, usually by beating the other side into submission. He is a fantastic contrast, not just to the heroes of this world, but to other similar characters in broader superhero fiction. He should be the Batman type. He should be a lot more patient and methodical. He should have these gadgets and these tricks and these traps that he's using to take down his foe. But he doesn't. He just charges in and pounds them into the dirt until they can't stand anymore. And that is such a brilliant contrast and makes him feel just so different to other similar heroes that I have seen before. And to be fair, the reason that he does this isn't just because he's a blunt object. It might well be purely and simply due to the fact that he knows that he can't outlast most villains, so he has to be fast and brutal. And this creates a great dynamic for him. He is just this unsubtle brick of a man, and that makes him such a fascinating character to see on screen. Sure, there is a part of him that wishes that he was a little bit more deranged and a little bit more crazy, but for what we get of him, I think that he's perfectly well treated and well healed. Now, for the sake of clarity, I don't dislike Popstep. I think that she's a neat character in concept, and to be honest, whilst I think that the whole thing of her being a play on idol culture is something that doesn't really translate all that well outside of Japan, because that whole culture doesn't really exist in the West, you can still kind of shrug it off and just see her as being a wannabe influencer or a wannabe pop star. And for her, the current dilemma is that the fact that she's stuck between being a student, an amateur pop star, and being a vigilante, with all those things being, quite frankly, opposed to one another. You can't be a good student if you're overly focused on your media efforts. You can't be a successful pop star if you're wanted by the police. And you can't be a successful vigilante when everyone knows who you are. This endeavour creates this really interesting conceptual malaise, this interesting soup of ideas for her as a character, but I do feel that she needs to be better developed to rise to that occasion. Again, this is still early days. She might still have time to go and to grow, and I feel that she does need, broadly speaking, to be rounded off a little bit more. And I'm certain that will end up being the case, but I still feel that we need to understand her motivations for doing all of this. Why is she the way she is? Why is it that she's doing all of this? Even if ultimately it's just for selfish reasons, I would like to know as to why she does all of this. But again, I'm sure that we'll end up seeing it because this is early days. I do like the core story for the most part. It feels rather grounded, far more so than the main series, and feels far closer to the true nature to this side of the world. the My Hero Academia world has this darker shade, this darker shadow to it, which I feel that a lot of commentators and viewers often overlook, and this feels like it's starting to lean a little bit further into that, without doing it in such a way that it ruins the lighter, brighter tone of the main series. This is a series, Vigilantes, at least for the time being, where the main thrust is not we need to stop the world-ending bad guy, it's we need to take drugs off the street. And I like that. Trigger is a drug that we see in the main series, but it's only there sprinkled in. It's not really a core story element, it's just there to add a twist to a fight. Now, I will admit that the presence of Trigger within Vigilantes is something that I'm in two minds over. On the one hand, it does make the whole world feel a lot more complete, as it makes Trigger feel a lot less like a plot contrivance and a lot more just a natural part of this world. It feels like it's just a genuine fact of life that drugs like this exist, and it isn't just there for the sake of a plot contrivance to make the fight at the end of this particular episode that we'll get into more difficult. On the other hand, I do wish that Vigilante's story was focused on something that wasn't so attached to the main story. Granted, it's not a strong connection because, again, Trigger wasn't really much of a big thing in the main series, or at least not what I've seen of it thus far, but I understand why it is in the series, I understand why it is here, it adds a level of grit to things, but I do worry that when you start to get into this thing of having plot threads between the two series quite like this, it starts to feel a little bit, for want of a better phrase, incestuous. It's like later on in the My Hero Academia series when we hear that Redestro's grandmother came up with the phrase quirk, which feels just so ludicrous, it feels like it should be an unreliable narrator thing, but I worry that this is where that phrase has come from, and it feels way too coincidental for my liking. Granted, that might not be the case here, but all the same, it does feel odd that we're going back to the same well as far as story is concerned, with our main plot thread at the moment being something that arrived in the main series. All the same, I will admit that this series did redeem itself slightly towards the end. I thought that the Salaryman was a great idea for a villain. I thought that it was a great concept for it, and they had a really creepy figure. I thought the Lagoons that Crawler fought in the first episode were great potential recurring characters, and neither set of them ended up coming back, and the Salaryman's absence left a rather big void in the story that wasn't really filled up until the end of it. This series needed a recurring villain, and thankfully, by the looks of things, we're starting to get that now with Bee, and I won't echo what I said about her in my previous video, but I think that she cuts a wonderfully sinister and creepy figure, and I really want to see more of it and see how she actually impacts upon the main story. Trigger and the supply of it really isn't enough to hang an entire series on, at least without it becoming too repetitive, which is sadly what I felt was the case in this particular volume towards the middle of it, though I will discuss that in a little bit more detail when we get into the negative section. I am glad that towards the end of this volume things start to feel a lot more focused again, though to be fair I think that's just kind of a part and parcel as to the kind of story that this is. With My Hero Academia, it's set in a high school, so if you're stuck for plot ideas, you can easily just translate life events that you would end up having at a high school into a superhero setting quite easily. Plenty of pieces of fiction have done that to varying different degrees of success, and maybe had My Hero Academia not gone down the narrative path it ultimately chose to do, we would have seen a lot more translations of the stuff like, oh, they need to find a date for the prom, they're struggling with their big English exam, they don't know what to do for their work placement, that kind of a deal. Which is stuff that is easy to translate into a setting like this. Vigilantes doesn't really have that crutch that it can lean upon without leaning more into traditional superhero territory, which is ultimately what we kind of end up getting, which is fine. I just want to see what else they can then end up doing with it. I will admit that it is hard to talk in depth about this story because of just how early we are into everything. I can't talk about the deeper subtextual nuances of the character and the world that we're currently inhabiting, and it's all still rather fresh. We're only 5 episodes into this. I cannot wax lyrical about the aspects of this world in quite the same way as I can do of the main series. I can't talk about Crawler in the same way as I talk about Izuku Midori because we've only had 5 episodes with him as of yet. And things will change and things will evolve as time goes by, but broadly speaking, it is very much a case of so far so good. With that said, however, I do feel that we need to get into the negatives. as I mentioned previously, I do feel that the mid-section of this particular volume started to get a little bit too repetitive and started to feel increasingly directionless, with many episodes just boiling down to our heroes looking for a lead on trigger, someone takes trigger, a fight breaks out, and our heroes win, with a few slight variations here and there to keep the story spinning, maybe a little bit more of a lean into backstory, maybe a little bit more of a lean into wacky fun times with introducing the fake X-Men characters, which is stuff which is fine, but when the main thrust of an episode is almost exactly the same as the one previous to that and the one previous to that, it starts to feel as though we're just spinning our wheels a little bit here. Again, as I've said previously and many times thus far in this review, this is early days and this is still at a point in the development of this series where it's trying to find its identity. Though I do feel that the repetition does rob its audience of a chance of a sense of greater variety within the main story itself. It takes away time that could have been spent better developing our characters, the world, and the core mystery therein. And there is a part of me that worries that if this is ever turned into an anime, you're gonna get a lot of people asking, well, is this it? When they've functionally seen potentially 3 episodes on the bounce that have been functionally near identical to one another. And I do worry that certain broadcasters on YouTube will then get their knives out for it, because that is what they often do, because let's face it, there is a cottage industry around that kind of stuff now. A lot of disaster YouTubers just chomping at the bit to kick whatever media misstep that's come along this week, but we'll see about where all this goes. Beyond all of this, you know, it's fine, it's good, and as we pivot into the overview, I have to say that I've enjoyed this particular volume quite a lot. I do feel that it struggles in the mid part of it, but even still, there's still great things that can be had. There's still great plot points, there's great story elements, there's fun moments with our characters, some bits that really make them tick and make them feel identifiable, and I'm really glad that I've started reading this, and hopefully when my next copies of the manga come next week, I'll be able to continue this on and have a great time. With all that said and done, let's get into Comment Corner! Now it's time for Comment Corner, just one comment this week, and it comes from Big X1, who says, yeah, this is a fun way to end the volume. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the next one. Thank you for the comment, and yeah, I think that the previous episode of this particular manga was great. It was a lot of fun, with some really creepy elements within it, and I am really interested to see where we end up going forward with this. I do wish I was able to review this week, but this is all I can do, things that haven't arrived on time, and I've got a very busy week this week, so I can't do a last-minute video. With all that's said and done, I hope that you enjoyed this particular video. Let me know what you thought about the volume thus far. Let me know what you think about My Hero Vigilantes thus far. Thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!